What's up, Internet? You're tuning in episode 167 of the FlipScreen Games Podcast, a weekly video game podcast where two best buds from different nations come together to discuss the wide, wide world of video games. I'm your host, Pete and Bessie, joined as always by my very good friend and co-host, Mr. Steven Radford.
Hello, hello.
Hello, Steve. We got a very special birthday in the house today. PlayStation is turning 30.
Yeah, us too. We're turning 30 again this month. It's great. I'm looking forward to it.
Are we at the? We're gonna start lying about our age. That's where we're at now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been doing it for years. I'm really 40, but it's fine.
So yeah, obviously PlayStation's been kind of celebrating the anniversary all year. But we thought that this would be a good week to zero in and focus on the specific birthday itself. And I know you were thinking it'd be fun to maybe take a little walk down memory lane here with some of the big milestones over the last 30 years of PlayStation.
Yeah. I mean, obviously they've got a lot of celebrations that they're doing underway at the moment. I don't know if you've updated your PlayStation yet, but those themes are so cool, Pete. Well, I'm so happy.
Here's the thing, Steve. I have a little story I've not had an opportunity to tell you and Max. My PlayStation is broken.
What did you do to it?
I didn't do anything. It was one of the weirdest experiences I've ever had with a piece of hardware. Where I was playing Plucky Squire, right? I'm in the middle of it. I guess I'm almost at the end of it at that point. And the game had like a moment where it like froze up, and the game didn't like freeze, but it was one of those like my character is still moving, but like
lagging.
Yeah, the game's not progressing, and it's like something's just like off. So I was like, okay, like let me restart, right? I restart it, just won't turn back on, and it's doing this thing. I looked it up. It's like other people have had this problem where like you press the power button and it just like does like 2 quick beeps and just like won't turn on.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm out of warranty.
Are you sending it in for repair?
I mean, I'm gonna have to, but like it's just not really in the budget right now. Because it's like I'm out of warranty, so it's gonna be like probably $200 to get it fixed. It sounds like from what I've seen.
That's not what you need right next to Christmas.
No, exactly. Yeah. And, I finished Astrobot and everything. The only game I was playing on it was Plucky Squire. And, I was like at the end of the game. I was like in like the penultimate chapter, which is a bummer. But, it's like.
You got a feel for it.
Yeah, it's I enjoyed it for what it was. But it's not like it was like I wasn't like super gripped by it, so it's like I'm happy to roll credits on it when I get my PlayStation fixed, but yeah, aside from that, makes me glad that I ended up deciding to get Dragon Age on Xbox, because that would have been really annoying. To be right in the middle of it and have that happen. But it's been busted for a couple weeks. I'm gonna have to send it in and everything at some point. I've not been able to enjoy any of the new. I'm like looking at it over the fence. I'm like, oh, it's so cool. Like, I love that. And my 30th anniversary controller came and I can't use it. I'm like so disappointed.
Well, you're welcome to send that to me if you decide that you don't want it, for whatever reason.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, if you want to pay the premium price for it so I can fix my PlayStation 5.
That'd be perfect. I'm sure some scalper just in time for Christmas would love to take that.
I know. I'm genuinely thinking I might try to sell it for like what it's going for on eBay and everything now, so I can get my PlayStation fixed. Normally I'm not one for scalping, but I'm like, oh geez, like I really want to get it fixed, but like you said, it's holidays, and I just went on a trip and everything. I don't really have $200 to just like throw around right now. So especially if there's other games I want to play this year, which there are. So we'll have to see on that one, but. Yeah, so I didn't mean to start this episode off that way, but you threw that one to me, so here we are.
Oh, well, I hope you get it fixed soon. Yeah, that's a real shame.
So I like you said, I know you wanted to do a bit of a walk down memory lane here. How did you envision us starting?
Well, I don't know if you want to talk about our history, but I guess maybe probably talk about PlayStation's history first, right? Like where it came
Sure.
from, how it came to be. Because I think most people listening will know that it started out as a joint venture with Nintendo, but some people might not.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of a wrinkle to that story that a lot of people probably don't know unless they've read Console Wars, which is like I always think it's interesting how this part of the story doesn't really get talked about as much. But yeah, so basically the long and short of it is the PlayStation starts getting developed by Ken Kutaragi and his team, and it was getting worked on as early as 1988, which was when that was like the CD based add on for the Super Nintendo, and the plan was that that was going to be kind of this like way to extend the life of the Super Nintendo a little bit longer, get Sony into Nintendo into disc based gaming, and yeah, that would be kind of how Sony got their feet into the games industry, because they were known for developing hardware, right? But they were kind of apprehensive about launching a console on their own for a lot of reasons. And, kind of famously, right, in 1991, it was at the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. Sony announced that they were going to be making this peripheral with Nintendo, and then literally the next day, Nintendo announced that actually they were going to be doing it with Philips, which famously, led
that
to
became the CDI, and that was like a disaster. It really wasn't anything like what the PlayStation became, right?
Well, and it's kind of both things there, because there's they did end up making the CD-ROM attachment for the Super Nintendo. It just wasn't particularly notable. And then as part of that, they were able to make those bootleg Zelda games on the Philips CDI. And yeah, and that like made these kind of like, licensed but not really licensed Nintendo games. And yeah, it's a very interesting story how it all played out. But also, it kind of created a monster, right? That Nintendo's like still battling to this day, which will always be interesting to me. But I think the kind of lesser known part of the story that gets explored in Console Wars by Blake J. Harris, which is a great book that we've recommended on the show before. But if you're interested in video game history, particularly what was going on in the 90s, and kind of like what is that? That's the sixth generation of consoles.
Sixth, I think.
Sixth.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because like they all came out at very different timelines. You had the SNES and then a huge gap to the N64. But in that time, you had the Mega Drive, the 32X, the Sega CD, and then on top of that, the Saturn. By the time that the N64 had come out,
right? Yeah, and somewhere in the middle there, the PlayStation. So before PlayStation had decided to kind of go it, or Sony, I should say, decided to go it alone with the PlayStation, there had been a pretty serious conversation about Sega and Sony teaming up. And Tom Kalinske, who is the president of Sega of America, was working with Olaf Olafsson and Mickey Schulhoff, who were both they worked at Sony's Electronic Publishing and then Sony of America, respectively. And they had planned on doing, kind of like, again, right, like partnering with them for the next Sega console. And this ended up falling through, in part because, the kind of stated reason was Sega wanting to have hardware that existed for both 2D and 3D, and Sony thinking that they should just make a 3D console. But if you read Console Wars, like the story kind of goes that like there was a level of infighting at Sega between Sega of America and Sega of Japan, and Japan was where they were developing the hardware, and America was really like where they kind of created the whole like the marketing campaign and that like Sega Attitude era, like
blast processing,
like all that stuff came from the American side. So like Sega was a failure until Tom Kalinski's team kind of revitalized the brand, and that created a lot of jealousy and infighting between the two arms of the company. And Tom Kalinske like famously like did not really believe in the Saturn and pushed back on it and wanted to do this stuff with Sony. And finally like he kind of just was told to like back off, and that like they were going to be moving forward with the Saturn. And it's just so crazy to think like how different the industry might be today if either one of these things had panned out, right? That like, ostensibly, right, Sony never even enters the console race if they work with Nintendo. And, if they partnered with Sega, it's like maybe we'd still be playing, the Sega PlayStation 5, right? Like maybe that would be what was still going on today. It's crazy to think about.
Yeah, and instead Sega had like two failures of consoles. The coming off the back of the Genesis or the Mega Drive to go into the Saturn, which was a complete and utter failure, and then to go straight into the Dreamcast, where you just didn't play it right, and you went up against the PS2, which was like, wow, once again, Sony just put in a real kind of hammer blow to you, and really the final nail in Sega's coffin.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, speaking of which, like, I think that's like one of the biggest things about the PlayStation 1, and I think if you don't know too much about the kind of early days of the console, it's really interesting to see like how it all played out, because ultimately like Ken Kutaragi like went to the Sony board and was like Nintendo embarrassed us. Like they like, did this like public backing out of our deal and made us look ridiculous. And like we have this great technology, like we have the opportunity to come in and like really like yuck their yum and like do something that's different and that could really like shake up the industry. And there wasn't a lot of belief in the project, but like the head of Sony at the time really liked Ken and thought he was like just like an interesting guy, and that like he believed in the kind of like fire in his belly because he felt like he had been like disrespected, and they had just such a really aggressive like approach to like creating inroads in the industry when they were like brand new, like obviously there was like the emphasis on 3D graphics and everything, and they were kind of like the first big console to come out and do that, right, in 1994. So like they had that advantage, but they also had a lot of other little like they made sure that the architecture was really simple to work with, so that development was really streamlined. They had obviously the ability to offer people to work with CD-ROMs, which were cheaper to produce than cartridges, but they also had a lot more memory, right? And like you could do like a 4-disc RPG, like something like Final Fantasy VII, right? And like those are things that just like weren't an option on the other consoles. But even beyond that, right? Like they didn't charge a licensing fee in the early days. So like you could just put your game on PlayStation because they just wanted to have games on PlayStation. So you have like all of these, it's kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts, right? It's like not only was it vastly cheaper to produce games on PlayStation because you weren't paying this licensing fee, because you were printing on CD-ROMs and, not having to deal with the kind of like draconian rules that Nintendo was known for at the time. You were putting it out on this like super cutting edge piece of tech, and like we're at this point where like the whole goal of it was to market to this kind of like new emerging demographic, right, of like people that had grown up with like the first generation of consoles and were now adults and were looking for something that was like made for a more mature audience, right, that like 18 to 29 demographic, right? And like all of those things were like, some of them were just being like at the right place at the right time and being really innovative, and some of them were just being like super aggressive to capitalize on those inroads, right? And it's like, oh, we want things for mature. Great, Square, why don't you bring Final Fantasy over to our side of the fence and make it on our, have a 4-disc edition on CD-ROM. And there's a lot of things that I think we kind of take for granted now as like being de facto, like, this is how things are on console that like Sony kind of cemented here, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, isn't it? I wonder which came first, the idea to allow multiple discs, or was it like someone like Square who's like, well, we've got this game, it's too big and we can't get it on these discs. Can you like, is there any way you can open this up and make it so that we can have multiple discs and play the game like across discs? Because that was really common on the PlayStation. There was a
Yeah.
fair few games where it was like, all right, you just open the tray and you can put your next disc in, and it carries on.
Some of the most notable ones, right? Yeah, totally. And yeah, it's like I wouldn't be surprised if it was just like a let's meet developer demand on this, because like it really seems like in those early days that was kind of like a key part of their strategy, right? Was just like, what can we do to make PlayStation the most attractive place to release your game, you know?
Especially when you're looking at the competition, right? You've got nothing really from Nintendo for at least a couple of years. Like in Europe,
Two
it didn't
yeah,
come
it's
out until
2 full years
1997.
before it released in Japan and then later in America.
Yeah, and then even later again in Europe and Australia, we didn't get it till late '97. And by that
Right.
point, PlayStation had been out here for 2 years, 3 years in Japan, and it's like, wow, okay, you've really got a good inroads there. And similar to, it reminds me a little bit of like when the 360 came out, right? And it came out a whole year before, and it's just like, wow, we've got this next generation. It's kind of next level when you think you're comparing this console where you've got like what games like Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider up against something like the SNES, where the bleeding edge was Star Fox, right? That was as
Right.
close as you came to 3D graphics on that console,
Which compared to
and
Crash Bandicoot looks
it's
archaic,
nothing.
you
Yeah,
know? Yeah.
yeah, it's crazy.
And not to mention, like, those are old consoles at that point, right? Like, there was that kind of like, we're talking about what's next. It's the same thing we're talking about now, where it's like, where's the Switch 2? Like, you have that like desire, that rumbling for something new. And yeah, like the PlayStation came out and it in every way was something new, you know?
Well, and then it brings in analog sticks. It brings in Rumble. It's bringing all of those things to the table. Granted, DualShock and stuff like that came a little bit later. I think that was probably after the N64. I'm not 100% on the
I think that's
timeline when we
correct.
got
Yeah,
sticks.
I think that was like 99, maybe even
And it's like
2000.
it's crazy how like it really just shifted. That really was the generation where you can look back at it and go, well, that looks like the controller of today. That is the same controller that we have
Yeah.
today. It's just gone through some iterations. And they used that all the way up to the PS3. It wasn't until the PS4 that we even got a new shaped controller. Like they mastered
Yeah.
that. They nailed that 100%.
And
And
even
the fact
the
that,
modern shape is not that much different, you know?
no,
Like it's like
yeah.
there's a kind of a pretty clear through line, you know?
And it's really only them that's done that. When you look at their their competition, right? Nintendo's had a new controller design every single console they've done. Sega, the same
Xbox
thing.
kind of is similar in that, like, obviously the Duke was originally very different, but the 360
Mhm.
controller kind of like,
Yeah, but you can still see it shifts and changes, and with every single generation, they kind of hone in. When they got to the Xbox One, I think they just like it really was minor tweaks from the Xbox One to the Series controller, but
yeah.
they 100% nailed it there.
I think like one of the crazy things about it too is just to think about like what a massive like success it was out the gate, and that like they were able to maintain that momentum, because it's like, like I don't know, it's kind of unprecedented, right? Because it's like Sega, right? Like they had like um the what's the one before the Genesis Mega Drive?
Oh, the Master
The
System.
Master System, thank you. And that was like it wasn't a major success, right? It was
Other than in Brazil.
sure. It wasn't until the Genesis that like they really popped off, right? And it's like Xbox, similar thing. The original Xbox is great and everything. 360 is really where it hit its stride and was able to
I mean,
be.
the original Xbox just came too late, right? Again, that's like you're trying to go up against the PS2, the best-selling console of all time.
Yeah.
Well, soon to be toppled, but like that had taken down the Dreamcast.
Right.
and kind of the place for those Sega games that was on the Dreamcast, they kind of migrated over to the Xbox, but there wasn't really much else there unless you were really into like Halo and maybe the kind of beginning of online console gaming.
Right. Which was a
And
big
the
deal,
Xbox.
you know, like that was definitely a big thing. But yeah, it was not on the level of the PlayStation 2, right? And yeah, I mean, like the PlayStation proper, right? The original, like it was the first platform to ship over 100 million units, which is crazy. Like it's still
That
one
is
of the best
crazy. Yeah.
selling consoles of all time, you know, in the grand scheme of things, which is really nuts. It's, you know, it speaks to, I think, just like how well they executed that entry into the market, you know, and that they like didn't ever take their foot off the gas.
Those things got so cheap towards the end of their life as well. Like
That
the tiny
PS1
little
redesign that was
PS1.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, it was like $100 or something.
It's like, oh, and you can get the little screen, take that in the car with you when you're taking the kids on holiday. I had so many when we were kids, we had so many different models of the PS1. Like we had the one with the actual colored ports in the back, and then we had the one where you had to like put in the little dongle and it kind of goes in. And I remember like one of the things I remember is they all had like slightly different BIOSes when you booted them up. They had like slightly different screens as to like because they came with a CD player as well, similar to the PS2 with like its DVD player.
Yeah.
The PS1 you could shove a CD in. If you didn't have a CD player back in the 90s, this was another route in for you to get one. You plug it up to your TV where you've maybe got like a home stereo system. You can put a CD in there and it just plays.
I used to do that all the time, and I would like watch you know, it had like the Windows Media
Oh, the
Player.
visualizer. Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Oh, yeah. That
so
was so
cool.
good.
It was so
Yeah.
cool.
Oh,
Um,
and the memory card blocks, like you'd go in there and you'd like manage the memory card, and it would like this takes up 2 blocks or 3 blocks, and it would be like 2 logos of the
yeah,
game
yeah,
stored on the memory card.
yeah. It was definitely that was like, and you know, I guess talk about our personal history a little bit. Like that was my entryway into like the wider world of games because I had my Game Boy prior to that, you know, and like that was like my first console, and I had played it for, you know, uh, I guess at least I don't remember if it was a year or 2 years between when I got that and when I got my PlayStation, but it was pretty shortly thereafter. Um, and I got like one of those like Costco bundles where it was like it's the console, but also it's like a bunch of games. Um, and that was like such a like moment, you know, of just like, oh my god, like just pop this one in. What's this one? Pop this one out. Pop this one in, and just like trying like all these genres I'd never touched before, like racing games or you know like
Yeah, yeah.
that was like where
Oh
I played
man,
Crash Bandicoot for the first time, you know, and like I had never played a fighting game before, and I got Tekken, and you know like
good.
things like that. Yeah, it was like such a like big, you know, like event in my childhood. I remember like that experience of like going to the store and bringing it home and cutting it open and like, you know, like reading all the instruction manuals and everything. And
So it was yours because in my household, as anyone that listens to the show will know, my dad's a big gamer. It was
right.
his. It was his PlayStation. It was like for the house, but it was his. Like he
Yeah.
he wanted it. He wanted to play. The game he really wanted to play was Tomb Raider 2, and he couldn't get it to run on his PC properly. It was like fucked up. I don't know what was wrong with it. So he was like, "Sod this! I'm going to buy a PlayStation." He bought a PlayStation and Tomb Raider 2, and he was able to play it. And I remember he got that for Christmas. It must have been 1997. Christmas 1997 was when we got the PlayStation, and that's
Hell
when
yeah.
he got the DualShock edition. He's still got the box at his house
Oh,
with
that's
like the
so
logo and stuff.
cool.
Like he's got the
Love that.
boxes for everything. He's still got like the bright yellow PS2 box as well,
So cool.
which is like keeps all of that stuff. And like there was a little zip bag, and we had to like when we were done with it, we'd unplug it from the TV and zip it away and put it back where it should have been. Whereas now they're like they are a focal point of the living room. They're always there. But back then it was like, oh, when you finish playing on the PlayStation, you unplug it from the TV and you put it away, and it was like
That's so
seen
funny.
as like a little thing that you kind of put away in the same way that I know you've got that like N64 bag. that I think a lot of people just kind of have
Yeah.
those bags that they pack things
See, and
away
like
in.
that for me was like never about packing them away though. It was always like for travel. It was
Or
like,
you take it to a friend's house kind of
or I'm
thing.
going to
Yeah.
grandma's house for the weekend or whatever, right? Like let's bring the PlayStation. We'll bring the
I
N64.
guess maybe it's different for you because it was yours. It was in your room. Whereas
Yeah,
there was three of us and we all had
yeah,
to share, and like we had to try and like find time on like the family TV alongside my mum wanted to watch like her soaps, or my dad
yeah.
wanted to watch
Right.
something after work, you know.
Yeah. So like, did you not have a you and your brother didn't have a television?
We didn't when I first got it. We got one maybe a couple of years later, and Dad got like a used PlayStation for us, so we had then had a
Nice.
second one like in our
Cool.
room. And similar to you, like we didn't have a lot of games when we first got the PlayStation, but what we did have was demo discs. Dad would get the official PlayStation magazine, and they would
Yeah.
always come with the demo disc, and we popped the demo disc in. And I remember playing like Medieval and like Gran Turismo and like all the demos on there. And
I
Dad
still
would like
have
get a
those
favorite.
discs. They're literally
Oh
behind me on
man,
my shelf over here.
that's so cool. Yeah, those demos were like great. Like that was that this was the era of the demo. Like you
Mm-hmm.
got the magazine, and previously on like the SNES, you'd look at the pictures and you'd go, "Oh, this looks really cool," you know. And I did a similar thing when I had my GBA. I'd look at the pictures and be like, "That game is
Yeah.
great. I'm gonna get that game." Whereas you could actually try it, and then what we would do is we'd get onto Blockbuster and we'd rent the game for the weekend and we'd see if we'd like it, and then we'd play it, and like we'd either finish the game that weekend, or if we hadn't, Dad would like, you know, oh, I'll just rent it again for another few days, or he'd buy the game if he really liked it, kind of thing.
Dude,
So it was really cool.
my mom was so funny about that because it would always be like, because you know they would have like you'd have the weekend rental, which was like the cheaper, right? So she would get it, and it would be like, all right, what's the review? Like, how close are we? You gonna finish it in another week? So we do the week, or is this like, do we go buy it? Because it's like, you know, like let's make sure we're not. I don't want to rent it another week and then find out you need it another week. Like if you like it that much, let's just go get it and save the money, right? Like let's be smart about how we're using this. Yeah, that was like definitely a thing. Like every Friday, my dad would take me to Blockbuster and check stuff out.
I miss that. I miss that so much because
That ritual was something.
You got to try so many games that way.
Yeah.
And like it was always, how the hell do I play this? Because you would never get the proper instruction manual. It'd be someone who's typed it up from like having read the instructions in the shop for like 2 minutes. And they'd be like, press X to jump, press circle for this. And you're like, I don't know what any of these things mean. I don't know what I'm meant to be doing in this game. And like you did it. It wasn't like games today where you have that tutorial level and it's showing you the controls and it's telling you everything. You were meant to read the instructions before you put the game in. You were meant to find out what you were doing, and it maybe gave you even like a little bit of a backstory and a synopsis. In the case of like Tomb Raider, for example, you found out who Lara Croft was.
That was something I loved about
story.
in the Tekken booklet. It had like character bios, and I was like, oh, it's so all this lore. Whoa, I loved that. It's funny because like you said, right? Like I'm an only child, so like I had when I forget when I got a TV in my room, but it was basically one of those like whenever Dad got a new TV or the living room, we would kind of just be like, okay, the old living room TV goes in the bedroom, then their old, I get that one. It's like I had a TV, I think maybe even before I had a console, just like.
I distinctly remember getting the TV because it was bright. It was a bright purple TV, like the plastic was purple.
Yeah.
And
I never had like a kid TV like that. Like mine was always
we did.
Whatever.
It was really cool. But we got it, and I shared a room with my brother, who is like three and a bit years younger than me, like, or 2 and a bit years younger than me. And he put a magnet on the screen of the CRT. Literally the day we got it on Christmas Day, my dad was so mad. He like took it back to the store and he was like, "Oh yeah, this TV's like gone purple. Like it's like purple." When I turned it on, it just looked really weird. The screen was fine. It had like degaussed itself by the time he'd taken it to the shop. But like we made sure that magnet was out the way. After that, so my brother couldn't put it on the screen.
That's so fucking funny. Oh my god, kids are so ridiculous with stuff like that. But yeah, I was gonna say, so like I had my own little like setup. Like I had like a rack that my consoles all like lived on or whatever, but I would unplug them a lot because like I would take it out into the living room and like play it with like my parents and I would play it together. But there was a period where my PlayStation was in my dad's room because he got way addicted to like 2 or 3 games and was like playing them in like after I would go to sleep.
Oh, that's funny. What do you know what games they were?
Yeah, the game that he liked the most was Gex 2, which was
Really?
I think it was called Deep Cover Gecko, or it might have been Enter the Gecko. I forget which one it was. But it was the first like 3D one. It was the one that had I believe the comedian's name is Dana Gould and he did the voice and everything. So yeah, that was like he got so into that game. He was like sucked into it. And literally, like I remember finally when he like put it back in my room, he was like, "I gotta stop. I'm like seeing it at night. Like I'm dreaming about it. I gotta." He like finished the game and he's like, "I gotta be done."
The best games. Those are honestly the best kind of games.
I
When
know.
they get that hold into you and you just can't stop thinking about it.
But yeah, we played games together all the time. But yeah, that was like he got into that and he got into Crash a little bit, but he was frustrated but he wasn't better at it. He preferred the like more like open environment thing.
I get that. Yeah, no, those are good. Yeah, I mean, some of my favorite games of all time are on that console, like Toy Story 2, for example, one of the best like collectathon 3D platformers. I Theme Park, Theme Hospital, that generation is just like phenomenal. Resident Evil, I was probably too young, but I remember watching Dad play Resident Evil.
Yeah, totally.
And, like, it was so cool, like seeing these zombies and like stuff. It's like an adult game, you know. Tomb Raider 1 and 2 and 3, right? Like they're all on there. Great games. I think 4 maybe as well, but I played that on the Dreamcast because it was slightly better. Yeah, I love the PlayStation 1. I think out of every console ever, that's probably my favorite console of all time. The PlayStation 1.
Really?
Yeah,
That's
I have
crazy.
such nostalgia for it. It was just like it's a phenomenal console. It
Yeah.
did so much to like bring the industry forwards.
I think I would agree with you if you're just talking about. Oh, it's tough though. It's like it's probably between that and the Game Boy for the same reason. But like in terms of like
If you're stuck in home
aesthetic,
consoles, I'm
you
stuck
know?
in home consoles.
Because like I think if you were gonna ask me like what's my favorite, like I'd probably go with something else based on like library and stuff, you know. But like just in terms of like the vibe of the console, like that startup sound, like the it's like it really does like give me that real warm fuzzy
Yeah, it's great.
nostalgic feeling for sure. Yeah. So we'll talk about the rest of the 30 years of PlayStation in just a minute here. But before we do that, let me remind you that this episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast is brought to you by our Patreon producers for the month of December. They are, of course, Arnold J. Rimmer, Christopher Valen, Steve Stompy, Susan Likes Cats and also Boobies, Voodoo Vic, Ty the Dude, and Waka Hula. Thank you all so much for your support over on patreon.com/FlipScreenGames. You all the reals to the real, and we greatly appreciate your support of this and all of our sister shows. Remember, if you want to get involved, you want to show your support, you want to check out those shows, Nintendo Noise and the Nintendo Noise and the Steam Deck podcast. You can do all that and much more by heading over to flipscreen.games. However you choose to get involved to show your support. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the show. So I think it's funny because like I have all those like core memories about the PlayStation 1, but like the PS2 is also a really like core memory for me because it was the first time I ever lived through a generation change. I had never upgraded hardware before. It was always just like, this is what you play games on. And then it was like, I remember I had gotten to that point where I was like a real enthusiast and I was reading Electronic Gaming Monthly and Nintendo Power and, all these other magazines. And I remember like the lead up to the hardware and like the whole like, there's a new console coming and it's it's going to come out on this date and this is all the graphics are going to be better now and just like going through that whole like, oh man, like everything's going to change, and like the first time I'd ever really lived through that when it came to hardware. Like I'd been excited about like sequels to games before and stuff like that, but not this, right? It's
Yeah,
like
it's black now. It's not grey anymore. It's
no.
totally different.
And it had a blue box and it was intense. You know, it was like, "Ooh, this is adult. This is so grown up. It can play DVDs, you know?"
Yeah, and it can sit upright. I think that was a big thing as well for a lot of people. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, this was now designed to be part of your entertainment system. It had a
Right.
tray. It wasn't meant to be that you flip the lid open and it's like sat on the floor like your SNES was. It's like it lives there. It can play DVDs. It can play games. It just becomes
It's the
part of
center of
your
your living room.
home setup. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's become the entertainment center.
And of course, like this was like what kind of cemented Sony, I think, as being like the dominant force that they are. You know, like obviously the PlayStation was a big success, but it's like so is the Sega Genesis, right? And it's like, and Sega never repeated that success, right? So the PS2 is like, I mean, it's kind of hard to overstate what a big deal it was, right? Because obviously, we talk about it's the best selling console of all time. It sold 160 million units, but like it sold more than more than triple the combined sales of the other competing consoles that generation, right? Like it absolutely decimated the Dreamcast, the GameCube, the Xbox. Like, not to say that the GameCube and Xbox don't have great libraries and that people didn't love them. Of course they did, but it's like, yeah, man,
But
like
like the Xbox was fighting a losing battle. It was up against known contenders. It's up against PlayStation. It's up against Nintendo. We know what they are. The Dreamcast is gone. Is dead at this point. But the GameCube did the exact same problem that the Dreamcast did. It didn't use DVDs. It didn't use normal sized discs, and I think that really was an easy sell for parents to go, oh, you know what? I wanted a DVD player anyway. Little Timmy wants to play games. I'll just get this.
it was
It's
also
like the
cheaper
same
than
price.
most
Yeah.
other DVD players, so it was like, yeah, no brainer, right? Like, yeah, I can get this. I can watch DVDs, and the kid is excited that they got the new console. It's like slam dunk, dude. And it also had a bunch of other firsts, right? It was the first console to have analog sticks, like dual analog sticks at launch. It was the first backwards compatible console, and it is unique in that like it sold for a lot longer than I think most people realize. Like well into the PlayStation 3 generation, it was still selling. It was still popular, especially in certain markets, like in Brazil, for example, where like import is like taxes are like insane. People kept playing the PlayStation 2, and it only got discontinued at the beginning of 2013, which was when they
That's
were that was when they were
crazy.
starting production on PS4.
Yeah,
So
that
it's
is
like
crazy.
that's wild to think about, like that kind of like evergreen strategy that like Nintendo always tries to. Yeah, we'll keep selling the 3DS but eventually we're all going to move over, right? But it's like, yeah, no, like it maintained momentum, and new games were still being made for it until like Sony stopped supporting it. Like
What
FIFA
was it? FIFA? Just Dance?
came out on it every year. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it was crazy. I loved the PS2, not as much as the PS1, but I remember some games distinctly on there. Stuff like the Eye Toy, for example.
Yeah.
Where you
Started
had your
doing all their
little
real funky peripherals.
yeah, had your little webcam. You're like wiping soap bubbles off the screen and stuff. Oh,
Yeah.
it was so fun. There's just loads of goofy stuff that they did like that you don't really see anymore. And I remember actually being like my dad somehow, don't know how, probably read it in like the PlayStation magazine or something, got into like the beta test of the PlayStation Network, and like they sent us free games, and like we had the network adapter, and like we had to test these games. So we had like SOCOM Online and Twisted Metal Black before they came out, and we're just like beta testing these games, which would have been fucking cool. Like I would love to have spoken about that stuff now. Like,
Yeah.
but just stuff like that doesn't happen anymore. They don't just send random games into beta testers like out in public. It just doesn't happen. It's crazy.
I do remember I had a friend that had the network adapter, and that was like such a mind blowing thing of just like you're playing a video game online. Like, what do you mean? Like what do you mean we're like this? You're playing with people that are just somewhere else on the internet. Like it was such a strange thing. It was like only like 3 games I could do it too. You know, it was like very
Yeah.
odd, very odd.
Yeah, I mean, I had it a little bit with the Dreamcast. Well, that was still like working. Like I had like Toy Racer, and there was like a few other games on
Sure.
like the Dreamcast that I would play online. It never really felt like it though, because it wasn't like you were talking to people. It was just like,
Yeah.
oh, you're connected and you're playing against it. But you could have just been playing against a computer for all you know. But to have like the headset and like the full works and like you're talking to people and stuff, it's like now I really feel like I am connected to other people around the world. And like they really kind of ran with that into the PS3, and I really feel like that's really where kind of online came into its own, was in the PS3 generation. But it definitely started back in the on the PS2, and that's where we started getting the roots of the PlayStation Network.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to start talking about the PlayStation 3 generation, because that is really kind of like the first real misstep that PlayStation ever made. And like, you know, I think most people know that this now, that like they ultimately righted the ship, right? And like were able to catch up and eventually surpass the Xbox 360 in units and everything. But
But I think that was only because of the misstep that Xbox had with the Red Ring of Death and so many hardware failures.
I mean, even that though, like that happened, but PlayStation didn't catch up until after that was already like a well documented and like eventually a resolved problem with that final unit that like didn't do it anymore. And yeah, don't get me wrong, like if that doesn't happen, maybe PlayStation's not able to regain the ground, but I think it had a lot to do with like all of the efforts that they made once they had lost that ground, right? Cuz it's like they ended up doing like the slim model that was like more affordable. And you know,
Well, they ripped out the PS2 straight first, right? Because this was
it was backwards compatible with
compatible.
both of them. Yeah.
Yeah, and in order to keep that, they basically had to put an entire PS2 inside the console, because this was the first kind of real shift in terms of
Right.
architecture. They went to that core processor,
Which
and it was just
a lot was another
nightmare.
big problem
It was a
with it. It made development really difficult. And in the early days, like there was kind of like this, you know, issue with like there not being enough games. They took a big swing on Blu-ray, and they were a little early to that race. So like having a Blu-ray player was not as valuable as having a DVD player had been back then. So that wasn't something that helped out either. So yeah, just it was a lot of missteps and like a lot of like bad marketing and, you know, like kind of being overconfident that they were going to be able to just continue to replicate their success. But yeah, I mean, over time, like I think the thing that ended up really winning it over was that it had such a strong library of exclusives, and that like both from the PlayStation first party, but also like really a lot of cool independent games, a lot of games from, you know, smaller developers and people from different countries, and like just a lot of unique, interesting stuff that you could only play there. And that was like when you started to see like I think the kind of like modern PlayStation like studios system like kind of come together, right? And like studios that they owned, like Naughty Dog, right, like came into their own and became like what they are today, of like this well-known like art house, you know, developer, right? Rather than like they're the team that makes Jack and Daxter, right? Like, yeah. And it's like, those games are great. Crash Bandicoot was great. But like what we know them as now, right? Like really solidified during the PlayStation 3 era. And I think a lot of those risks and those kind of like that like the decision to like publish games like The Puppeteer and like, you know, like Tokyo Jungle and like just like weird games like that. It's like I think that was from being like our Journey, right? Like how do we differentiate ourselves from Xbox? How do we set apart like what is the unique thing that you can do at PlayStation? And it's like it was indies, it was Japanese games, it was weird artsy games, it was games that were trying to push the envelope of storytelling and like all those things, rather than like, on the Xbox side of things, not that those things weren't happening, right? But it's like they're mostly from the third-party developers that were putting their games out on both consoles. And like Xbox's efforts were more.
Well, to begin with, they weren't, right. Like it was, I think the Xbox Arcade came first, and like those kind of downloadable games were
Absolutely.
very much over the fence on Xbox only. But once PlayStation opened up the store and people could publish games there too, then it
Yeah.
definitely did happen.
But I was more saying like from the studios that they own, it's like
Mhm.
Xbox's focus was mostly on,
They're on the big hits, and even then, it's like stuff maybe that they don't even own that are exclusives. Like, we had things like Gears that was exclusive, but it was made by Epic Games. There
and then they
was
bought it.
BioShock that was exclusive for a limited period, but then it wasn't.
Mass Effect
So
was
it's like,
originally an exclusive. There was like plenty of like big exclusives from big publishers. But yeah, I mean, like a lot of the big games, like a lot of the focus was on multiplayer and was on Xbox Live and services and those sorts of things. Not to say Xbox wasn't innovating, but I think more that like there were types of games that you played on Xbox and types of games that you played on PlayStation. And yeah, there was plenty of crossover among, some of the big stuff. Like BioShock eventually came to PlayStation, right? Like,
same with Oblivion. Didn't that
Mass
take
Effect,
ages
right?
to come over? Yeah.
All those games eventually came over. But yeah, like there was a point where, the thing that was differentiating the PlayStation 3 was that like there was a lot of unique stuff that you could only play over there. And like I think, that is, to me anyway, feels like the kind of foundation for like the Sony studios, like Sony being like, oh, we're a place, we own all these studios and we have these prestige games that come out that you can only play on our hardware. In the same way that's how Nintendo makes their money, right? Like I think that was when, that kind of came into its own, when they finally had to compete and not just be the top dog.
Do you think they've lost some of that now because they are back on top, that they're not doing any of that cool stuff? Because it feels like forever since they've spoken about indies, and we don't really see
Yeah,
much of these smaller games that they publish
I do.
anymore.
I do think so. I think that's like the same reason that like, you saw Xbox like do Game Pass and like, buy all these
Yeah, the
studios and
idea Xbox and stuff, things like
uh-huh.
that.
And I think the reason that you like the same reason that they took a big swing on backwards compatibility, I think it's, the same reason that Nintendo like took a big swing on a hybrid console. It's like it's the same reason that we talked about earlier, like PlayStation's success in the first generation. It wasn't by just coming out and like playing it safe. It was by being aggressive and by doing things that were like outside the box. But when you're on top, like you don't need to do those things, so you don't. I think like the PlayStation 4, right? Like again, when it came out, it had this very strong, clear messaging of like it's games, it's not DRM, it's it's console first. It's like it was very, I think a lot of its success early was about saying the right things to the right people. And I think that once they kind of established themselves in that way, and again, not to say that there's been like a creative like drain or anything, right? I think probably many of the games that people would argue are some of the best PlayStation games of all time came out on the PlayStation 4, right? And like there was revitalization of like old franchises like God of War, and there was a bunch of new great franchises like Horizon and Ghost of Tsushima and like, stuff that people really fell in love with. So it's like, not to say that there's like less creativity or anything like that, but I feel like there's been less pressure on them to like make things that are weird or niche or that.
I think they're taking less risks. I think that
Absolutely.
they're risk averse, and they kind of, usually that is the case of people that are on top. They want to keep doing the same thing, stick to the status quo. And they were chasing trends maybe with the games as a service thing, but we don't get anything cool and fun and interesting. They're not taking those big risks.
No.
We might see them take some.
And I mean, I think there was like
future.
there was a lot of conversation last generation about how like every PlayStation first party game is like a third person open world action adventure game that's story driven. And like that wasn't always the case. And I mean, this generation, I think you are starting to see them get away from that a little bit, right? With stuff like Helldivers or what was that one from? Oh my God, I can't think of it. It's the one that's like it's from the arcadey studio, and it's like
Mm-hmm.
it's a Metroidvania, but it's third person, and you know the one I'm talking about. I can't think of the name of the
I
game.
do know the one you're talking
I want to
about.
say Control, but I know that's not it, obviously. But it's like I can't think of the name. It's Housemark, right? It's their game.
It is Housemark, yeah.
What the hell's the name of it? You got to tell me, or I'm gonna be stuck.
It's Returnal.
Returnal. Thank you. Um, yeah. So like, I think you are seeing maybe them like start to see that they need to be a little bit more experimental and they need to have
Yeah,
different
and like,
offerings. But I do think that you're right. Like, yeah, like you look at the breadth of creativity during the PlayStation 3 generation when they were behind and they had something to prove versus now, and like, yeah, like it's night and day.
you look at something like Little Big Planet.
Right.
That came out in the PS3 generation. That was so innovative. It was so fresh. We've never seen anything like it, and it's just like I feel like it's been a while since we've had something like that from PlayStation, where it's been like,
Yeah.
oh, this is so out of the box. I mean, Astro's Playroom maybe, but it is just a 3D platformer. It's not like it's not reinventing anything.
Yeah.
And
And
stuff like Returnal, that was a third party studio. They bought them, so
Right.
like it wasn't their game initially. So it's just like I'm yet to see something from their studios that isn't third person action adventure game. And
Yeah.
that's fine because I like third person action
Me too,
adventure story
but-
driven games.
But yeah, but you do have that kind of like, I do wish we had a little bit of that PlayStation 3 era energy here, you know, and like, you know, you saw them do a similar thing on the Vita when like that didn't pan out, where it's like, you know, trying to like double down on like, you know, novels that or not novels, excuse me, genres that are underrepresented, like visual novels or
Visual novels where they're a lot.
right, like visual novels or JRPGs or indie games, and like that was like where it ended.
It was things that you weren't playing on mobile.
Right.
But it wasn't necessarily what they were doing with the Vita, which was let's take a full experience and just put it on a mobile device, because I don't think people were necessarily looking for that. We weren't looking to play like an original Uncharted game on a handheld. I was.
Well, and like the
but I don't
support
think-
wasn't there,
Sorry.
right? That's the thing too. Is like they put out a couple of those games in the early days of the console, but then like it struggled to sell because of proprietary memory, and then it's like so people didn't buy those games, so they didn't fund more of them, and it's just like it was a self-fulfilling prophecy after a while, right? It's like you can't put out a piece of hardware and not support the library on it. Like every success story they've had has been because there was a really attractive library, right? And it's a good price point, good games to play. Like
The
that's
PSP suffered from the same thing with the proprietary memory, but it was a case that I mean, you bought most of the games then back on those UMDs, the discs,
Yeah.
the little mini discs that you put in the drive, and it was like an optical solution rather than expensive flash memory. You did need a little stick that you put in the side to save your games,
But it was like you
wasn't-
were trained to do that with memory cards, right? Because memory cards were always a thing, but they weren't crazy expensive. You know, it was like, oh, okay, like I buy this to put my save data on. But it was like for the Vita, it was like, you know, it's like you were essentially adding like 30% of the cost of the console on it if you wanted to have any number of games on the thing, which is like obviously a problem.
Yeah, I should dig out my memory cards and sell those. They're probably worth a fortune.
Maybe, I don't know.
If people actually care about the Vita still.
Yeah, so I know we kind of like skipped over the handheld stuff, but I mean, I was a big fan of both of them. I was a late adopter on the Vita, but I loved the Vita and I loved the PSP. I was very into
PSP
that.
was great.
was
Yeah,
like-
I love the PSP.
It was like my first like multimedia device like that. It was like pre-smartphones, you know, where it's like, man, like
And I bet you got into the homebrew hacking, putting the emulators on there. Like,
emulators. I had music on it for a little while, but you know, then I was like, I got the iPod or whatever. But like movies and stuff, like you know, there's like the
you just feel so fucking cool when you're going into school and you're like, yeah, I've got Spider-Man on movie on there. I've got this like I can
Oh,
play like I can play Mario on here as well. And you
Yeah.
just like you're showing it off.
such a flex, such a flex. Yeah, which is probably why mine ended up getting stolen at one point because people were jealous
Oh.
of my library on there. But yeah, it was a bummer. I don't have a PSP anymore.
I don't have one because like the laser died on the
Oh no,
disk drive.
that sucks.
And like just burnt out. So yeah, that thing went.
I've still got my Vita though.
I still have my Visa, yeah. The original OLED model. Love that thing.
Nice, very cool. So yeah, I think it's I don't know, it's very interesting. I think maybe part of my affection for PlayStation is the like fact that like I've been around for the whole thing, where it's like Nintendo like predates us.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I
and
understand that.
Xbox came around when we were like already,
I do really like Xbox though, because it was like,
I do too.
got one at the beginning.
But
and I don't know if you saw the 8-bit Do Xbox keyboard. I want one of
pretty
those.
cool. Pretty cool. But you know what I mean? Like it's like I feel like it's the platform that has grown with me the most because like I was an infant when it came out and I got it when I was a very young kid in kind of the middle of its life cycle and I was there for the whole run and then I've been kind of on the ride ever since then. But I guess I did have I didn't really do the PS3 because I didn't have any money. I got it at the end of the life cycle.
Second job thing. Come on.
I didn't even have a first one, so that was a problem. It's like, what do you mean a second job? I'm 11. Like, it's like, I can't. I guess okay. I guess I'll play Halo.
And some of those PS3s had the cheapest build on them as well. Like some of those consoles are nasty. The one with like the sliding door that slides like that, and you just sort of pull the door.
Yeah.
Oh god, it looks like a George Foreman.
Yeah, the original silver one was pretty funky. But yeah, it's this was fun. This is a fun little walk down memory lane. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. I know many PlayStation fans in the audience, so hopefully you guys have some fun stories that you'll share over on the Discord or you want to write into the show for next week, however you want to get involved. You can do all that and more at flipscreen.games. That's the website where you'll find our sister shows, Nintendo Noise and the Steam Deck podcast. You'll find our Patreon if you want to go and show your support. All the ways to get involved, you'll find them over there. So however you're choosing to celebrate PlayStation's 30th birthday this week, thank you for joining us here on this very special episode. Thank you for being a member of the community. For the crew, I've been Pete. He's been Steve. We'll see you next week.